When the judge dismissed the case, the sound of the gavel seemed to echo longer than usual. But what truly filled the room was not the gavel. It was the sense of something bigger. People had witnessed history. They had seen a man humiliated in handcuffs rise in dignity when the truth came to light, and they had seen one of the most powerful military leaders in the country bow his head in apology. Marcus stood silently beside the general as the applause slowly faded. He was free now, yet his calmness remained. He did not raise his voice or smile proudly. His dignity was not in showing off, but in the way he carried himself. The general gave him one last firm handshake before stepping back, letting Marcus walk out of the courtroom on his own. The hallway outside was crowded. Word had spread quickly and reporters swarmed like bees. Cameras flashed, microphones were shoved forward, and voices filled the space with questions. "Mr. Hayes, how do you feel about the charges being dropped? Do you have a message for the police who arrested you? What will you do now?" Marcus raised his hand gently. His calm presence alone quieted some of the noise. "I don't need to shout," he said slowly. "What happened in there speaks for itself. I only ask one thing, that people learn to see each other as human before judging. That is all." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The cameras caught every moment, and soon his face and voice were on every television and phone screen across the country. The general walked beside him, but he allowed Marcus to lead the way. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered. Some clapped, others cheered, and a few saluted him as he passed. For many, it was the first time they realized that the quiet man they saw jogging through their town was someone extraordinary. Back at the police station, things were different. An internal review began almost immediately. The two officers who had arrested Marcus were called in by their chief. The footage from the grocery store showed clearly that Marcus had never put anything in his pockets. The basket had been full, his actions calm, and his words honest. The truth was undeniable. The officers lowered their heads, realizing the weight of their mistake. Disciplinary measures were promised, and the department prepared a public apology. The store clerk who had started it all also faced the truth. The video showed his accusation had been baseless. When reporters asked him about it, he stammered, realizing how quickly his judgment had nearly destroyed a man's dignity. The store itself issued a statement apologizing to Marcus, but the damage was already done. The community would not forget. Meanwhile, Marcus returned to his quiet home that evening. He placed his keys on the table, sat in his chair, and looked at the medals in the small wooden box he rarely opened. He thought about the courtroom, the general, the applause, and the flashing cameras. But most of all, he thought about the simple truth he had spoken, that respect should not depend on rank or medals. That night, he walked outside and looked at the stars. The cool air brushed against his face. For the first time in years, neighbors approached him. One by one, they came forward. A man from across the street said softly, "I'm sorry, Marcus. I didn't know." A young boy tugged his mother's hand and asked shyly if Marcus was a hero. Marcus knelt down, smiled gently, and said, "I just did my job. Remember, heroes are everywhere, even your parents when they take care of you." The boy's smile warmed Marcus's heart. He realized then that perhaps his story, though painful, had a purpose. Maybe it would teach others not to judge so quickly, to look beyond the surface and to honor those who served quietly. The next morning, the news had spread nationwide. Headlines spoke of the Marine sniper wrongly arrested and freed by the intervention of a four-star general. Videos of the courtroom salute played across television channels. Social media buzzed with his name and debates began. Some demanded reforms in policing. Others spoke about the respect veterans deserved. Marcus, however, kept to his simple life. He still went for his morning runs, still bought groceries, this time greeted with nods of respect instead of suspicious stares. People stopped him on the street, thanking him, apologizing, or asking to shake his hand. He always responded humbly, never letting pride take over. The police department, under pressure, held a public event. Their chief stood before cameras and acknowledged the mistake. He admitted that Marcus had been treated unfairly and promised changes in training and conduct. Then, in front of the entire town, he turned to Marcus and said, "We apologize for what happened to you. It should never have happened." Marcus, standing quietly, nodded but said only a few words. "Apologies matter only if they bring change. Make sure no one else has to go through what I went through." The crowd applauded, understanding the depth of his message. Weeks passed, and while the noise of the media began to fade, the memory of that day in court did not. In military circles, Marcus's name rose again. Young recruits heard about the sniper who had served with unmatched discipline and who had endured injustice with dignity. His story became more than just one man's struggle. It became a lesson in patience, honor, and humanity. The general visited Marcus once more, quietly, without cameras this time. They sat in Marcus's small living room sipping coffee. The general smiled and said, "You reminded me today what true strength looks like. Not the strength of weapons, but the strength of character." Marcus chuckled softly. "I never wanted to be remembered for this, General. I wanted to live quietly." "And you will," the general replied. "But sometimes the world needs reminders." You gave them one. When the general left, Marcus sat back, feeling a quiet peace. Life would never be exactly the same, but he knew he had stayed true to himself. He had endured without anger, spoken with calmness, and reminded people of something simple yet powerful, that respect is for everyone, not just for those with stars on their shoulders. In time, the grocery store clerk moved away, unable to face the shame of what he had caused. The prosecutor's career slowed, his name tied forever to the case. The police officers involved were reassigned after disciplinary action. The town itself changed, slowly but noticeably. People learned to pause before judging, to look twice, to listen before assuming. As for Marcus, he remained the same man he had always been. A quiet jogger in the morning, a man who fixed things in his yard, a neighbor who nodded politely. But now, behind every wave and every greeting, there was respect. Not the kind given to a celebrity, but the kind born of understanding, of knowing the truth behind the man. And so, the story of the Marine sniper who was handcuffed, then freed by truth, became more than just an event. It became a lesson that traveled far beyond the courthouse walls. For those who saw it, for those who read about it, and for those who remembered, it was a reminder that dignity can survive chains, and true honor can. Marcus Johnson was a man who most people passed by without a second thought. He was tall, strong from years of steady work, but he carried himself with quiet dignity that made him almost invisible in the busy halls of the courthouse. For over 20 years he had worked as a janitor, pushing his cart from one corridor to another, polishing floors until they shined, and emptying bins full of papers that other people had tossed aside without a second glance. Every day he wore the same faded uniform, and every day people brushed past him, treating him like part of the furniture, rather than a man with thoughts, dreams, and a story of his own. Yet behind those calm eyes, Marcus carried a secret. He loved the world of law. He loved the way arguments were made, how evidence was laid out, how truth and lies collided in the courtroom. While others thought he was only sweeping floors or mopping corners, Marcus was listening, carefully catching every word spoken during trials. He paid attention to the lawyers, the judges, the way they built or broke a case. And late at night in his small apartment, he opened second-hand law books he had bought from thrift shops and studied them until his eyes grew heavy. He marked pages, memorized rules, and tested himself by rewriting arguments he had heard earlier in the day. He knew he could never afford law school, but his heart told him knowledge did not only belong to the rich. It belonged to anyone who was willing to learn. Most people never noticed his sharp mind. To them, Marcus was just the janitor. Even when he helped people find a lost item or offered a kind word, they rarely remembered his name. But he never complained. He told himself that his moment, whatever it would be, might come one day. And until then, he would keep learning quietly, sweeping floors with one hand and turning pages of law books with the other. It was on a bright Monday morning that his world began to change. The courthouse was unusually crowded. Reporters were rushing in, cameras were flashing outside, and people whispered with excitement about a case that was about to begin. At the center of the storm was a man named Alexander Cross, a billionaire who had built an empire of hotels and real estate. He was powerful, wealthy, and famous for both his successes and his controversies. Some people admired him, others despised him, but a lot be hidden forever. Marcus closed his eyes each night with the same prayer he had whispered on battlefields long ago, that people would live with fairness, and that respect would be given where it was due. He knew life was not perfect, but he also knew that sometimes, even in the darkest moments, light could break through. And in the end, that light was not just for him. It was for everyone. The afternoon air inside the courthouse felt heavy with tension. Reporters whispered to one another, the jury settled in their seats, and the judge raised a hand to bring order. Everyone was waiting for the battle to begin. Alexander Cross, the billionaire at the center of it all, sat quietly at the defense table. His face carried the weight of worry, though he tried to mask it with a strong expression. Across from him, the prosecutor arranged his files with sharp precision, ready to strike. Marcus moved silently near the back of the room with his cart, broom, and mop. To most eyes, he was nothing more than part of the background, but his ears were wide open and his heart beat faster with every word he caught. He had a strange feeling, as if the day would not end like any other. The prosecutor rose first. He was confident, his voice loud and clear as he addressed the jury. He spoke about power, greed, and betrayal. He painted Alexander as a man who had risen high, but broken rules to get there. His words were strong and each sentence struck like a hammer. The jury listened with serious faces, some even nodding. The press scribbled down every phrase, certain they had the beginning of a dramatic fall for one of the country's most famous billionaires. Marcus felt the weight of those words. He could see how carefully the prosecutor had chosen them, how he had planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. But he also noticed the gaps, small cracks that could be widened if someone sharp enough pointed them out. He thought about how he would respond, what arguments he would bring, but he reminded himself that he was just a janitor. No one would ever let him speak in a courtroom. At last, it was time for the defense to respond. All eyes turned to Alexander's lawyer, the man in the expensive suit who had strutted into court that morning as though he were walking onto a stage. He rose slowly, smoothed his tie, and smiled toward the cameras before addressing the judge and jury. For a moment, it seemed as though he was ready to fight back with equal force. But then something unexpected happened. His smile wavered. His voice, though steady at first, began to tremble as he read from his notes. He skipped lines, repeated himself, and seemed distracted by the cameras flashing at him, rather than the seriousness of the case. Alexander leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but the lawyer brushed him off with a quick shake of his head. The judge's expression grew impatient. The jury looked confused, some even annoyed. Reporters exchanged surprised glances. Then came the breaking point. The lawyer suddenly stopped in the middle of his speech. He glanced at the prosecutor, then at the judge, and finally at his client. His face was pale now, his hand slightly shaking. In a voice that carried across the silent courtroom, he announced that he could not continue with the case. He claimed the pressure was too much, the risk too high, and that he was withdrawing as counsel effective immediately. For a moment, the entire courtroom froze. The judge slammed his gavel in anger, demanding order. The jury gasped. The reporters nearly fell over one another as they rushed to write down the shocking moment. And at the defense table, Alexander sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, unable to believe what had just happened. His own lawyer had abandoned him in the middle of court, leaving him exposed and defenseless before the law. The whispers spread like fire. People murmured about how this was the end for Alexander Cross. Some laughed quietly, saying that even his money could not buy loyalty when the pressure grew too high. Others shook their heads in disbelief, amazed that a man of his stature could be left stranded in such a public way. Marcus stood at the back, his broom resting against his cart, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He had watched many trials, but he had never seen anything like this. To leave a man alone in front of the entire court was not just careless, it was cruel. Alexander, for all his wealth and power, looked like a lost man at that moment, betrayed, humiliated, and on the verge of being crushed. The judge turned toward Alexander, demanding to know how he wished to proceed. Did he have another lawyer ready? Would he represent himself? Alexander tried to answer, but his voice broke. For the first time, the billionaire known for commanding boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals sounded helpless. I don't know, he whispered, his hands shaking slightly as he held onto the edge of the table. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Reporters leaned forward, waiting for the next words. The prosecutor folded his arms, a small smile forming on his lips as if victory had already been handed to him. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. It was in that silence, when every eye was fixed on the defense table, that a voice rose from the back of the courtroom. It was not loud at first, but it carried a strength that drew attention. "I will defend him." Heads turned. The judge paused. Reporters looked around to find the source, and there, standing beside his cleaning cart, was Marcus Johnson, the janitor. His uniform was plain, his hands still rough from years of work, but his eyes burned with determination. The courtroom erupted in laughter, gasps, and disbelief. Some thought it was a joke. Others shook their heads as though the man had lost his mind. A janitor, defending a billionaire in one of the most high-profile trials in the country. It sounded impossible, even laughable, but Marcus did not flinch. He stepped forward, his voice steady this time. "I will defend him," he repeated. "If no one else will stand by him, I will." The judge stared at him in shock. "You are a janitor," he said sternly. "This is a courtroom, not a stage for foolishness." Marcus bowed his head respectfully but did not retreat. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "I may be a janitor, but I have studied the law for many years. I have read your books, listened to your trials, and I understand more than people think I do. He cannot be left alone in this court. If the law means anything, it means fairness, and I will not stand by and watch him face this without defense." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. The reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they were witnessing a moment that would become a headline across the nation. Alexander lifted his head slowly, his eyes wide as he looked at the man who had just offered to save him. For a moment he did not see a janitor. He saw a man with courage, a man who was willing to risk laughter and scorn to stand for justice. The judge hesitated. It was clear that the rules of the court did not allow just anyone to stand as counsel. But the sight of Alexander without a lawyer, the public nature of the trial, and the courage of the janitor created a situation no one had expected. The judge called for a recess to consider what could be done. As people filed out of the courtroom, some shaking their heads, others whispering in disbelief, Marcus stood tall. For years he had swept those floors unnoticed, but now every eye was on him. Whether they mocked or admired, he did not care. He knew only one thing: he would not let Alexander face this alone. And deep inside, though he had never spoken it aloud, Marcus felt something awaken. This was the moment he had unknowingly prepared for through all those long nights with his law books, through all the hours he had spent listening in silence. Now the world would know that even a janitor could carry the fire of justice in his heart. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Everyone was still buzzing about the unbelievable words that had just been spoken. The janitor, the man they had all ignored for years, had stepped forward and offered to defend a billionaire. Some thought it was madness, others thought it was bravery, but no one could deny it had shaken the entire room. Marcus stood tall near the defense table, his hands calm but his heart pounding inside his chest. He had never spoken so boldly in front of so many people, yet something inside him had risen stronger than fear. He could not sit back and watch Alexander be left alone to be torn apart by a skilled prosecutor. The judge had called for a recess, and Marcus knew those few minutes would decide everything. Alexander sat in silence, still trying to process what had just happened. He had spent his life surrounded by powerful men, lawyers, investors, business partners, but none of them had ever stood for him in such a way. His expensive lawyer had abandoned him without shame, yet the man who swept floors and emptied bins had stepped forward when no one else would. Alexander studied Marcus, his sharp businessman's mind trying to understand him. Why would a janitor risk ridicule, laughter, and even punishment to defend him? When the court reconvened, the judge's gavel struck sharply and the crowd quieted. The judge's face was stern as he looked at Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," he said slowly, "this court cannot permit just anyone to act as legal counsel. The law is clear on this matter. However," he paused, letting the silence stretch across the room, "the court also cannot ignore the fact that Mr. Cross has been left without defense in a high-profile trial. He has the right to representation, and this situation is most unusual." The prosecutor immediately stood. "Your Honor, this is absurd," he said. "We cannot allow a janitor to disrupt these proceedings. This man is unqualified and will make a mockery of this court." Marcus faced him calmly. "With respect," he said, "this court has always been a place for truth. I may not wear a suit or have a degree, but I know the law. I've studied it for years, and I understand it better than people expect. If fairness matters here, then let me help this man until proper arrangements are made. I cannot stand by and watch him face this trial alone." Whispers ran through the courtroom again. The judge rubbed his forehead deep in thought. Finally, he said, "Very well. This court will allow you, Mr. Johnson, to assist the defendant temporarily. You will not be recognized as official counsel, but you may stand beside him, advise him, and speak when permitted." If you disrupt these proceedings, I will have you removed immediately. Do you understand? Marcus nodded firmly. I understand, Your Honor. The judge turned to Alexander. Do you accept this arrangement? Alexander, his voice low but steady, said, Yes, Your Honor. I trust him. The words surprised even Alexander himself, but they were true. In that moment, he trusted the janitor more than he had trusted the lawyer who had left him behind. The prosecutor shook his head in disbelief, but the decision was final. And so, in a courtroom filled with powerful people, Marcus Johnson, the janitor, walked to the defense table and took his place beside a billionaire. The trial resumed, and Marcus felt the weight of 100 eyes watching him. He sat quietly, his mind sharp, listening to every word as the prosecutor presented evidence. The prosecutor spoke with practiced skill, pointing to documents, witnesses, and records that painted Alexander as guilty. But Marcus was not intimidated. He listened carefully, taking notes on a pad of paper Alexander had pushed toward him. His handwriting was simple, but every note was clear and precise. When the time came for cross-examination, the judge hesitated, then nodded toward Marcus. Mr. Johnson, you may proceed. The courtroom fell silent again. Marcus rose slowly, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the witness stand. His steps were steady, his voice calm. He asked questions one by one, not in a flashy style like the lawyers people were used to, but in a way that cut directly to the truth. He asked about details others had overlooked. He pointed out small contradictions in the witness's story. He forced the witness to admit uncertainty where before they had sounded confident. The jury leaned forward, surprised by the clarity of his questions. Even the judge raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he had not expected such precision from a janitor. The prosecutor frowned, realizing that this was no ordinary man standing before him. When Marcus returned to the defense table, Alexander whispered, How did you know to ask that? Marcus gave a small smile. I've been listening for years. People throw away more than trash in these halls. They throw away truth, too. I've been picking it up piece by piece. Alexander sat back, astonished. He had built towers, managed empires, and dealt with the most powerful people in the world. Yet here was a man who had built knowledge quietly while sweeping floors. The next witness came forward. And again Marcus asked his questions with steady calmness. He didn't shout or show off. He spoke to the jury like an ordinary man speaking to neighbors, and that made his words land with more power. Slowly the room began to change. The reporters who had been laughing earlier now scribbled furiously, realizing they were watching history unfold. The jury that had looked at Marcus with doubt now looked at him with respect. And Alexander, who had walked into court feeling defeated, began to feel a flicker of hope. The prosecutor grew frustrated. He had thought this trial would be easy once the defense lawyer left, but now he faced a man who could not be intimidated. He tried to mock Marcus, making sly remarks about janitors and uniforms, but Marcus never lost his calm. He answered with simple logic, each word like a stone placed firmly in the foundation of his defense. By the end of the day, the entire courtroom had shifted. People who had dismissed Marcus were now whispering in amazement. The judge, though still strict, allowed him to continue. Alexander sat straighter, his eyes sharper, no longer crushed by despair. And Marcus, though tired, felt alive in a way he had never felt before. For the first time, he was not invisible. For the first time, people saw the man behind the broom, the man who carried years of quiet study in his heart. When court adjourned, reporters rushed forward, shouting questions. Who are you? Where did you learn this? Are you really just a janitor? Marcus said little. He only replied, I am a man who believes in fairness. That is all you need to know. As Alexander left the courthouse surrounded by cameras, he turned to Marcus and said softly, You didn't have to do this, but you did. Why? Marcus looked at him calmly. Because no one deserves to stand alone when truth is on their side. That night, as Marcus walked home to his small apartment, the city light shining above him, he felt no need for fame or praise. He had simply done what his heart told him to do. Yet deep inside, he knew the battle was only beginning. The prosecutor would come harder tomorrow, and the world would watch every move. But Marcus was ready. For years he had been silent, learning in the shadows. Now at last his voice had been heard. The next morning the courthouse was more crowded than ever. Word had spread across the city and beyond about the janitor who had stood up in court to defend a billionaire when his lawyer had walked away. Newspapers carried bold headlines, television cameras lined the steps, and people gathered outside just to get a glimpse of the man who had shocked the justice system. Some called him a hero, others laughed and said it was nothing more than a circus. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something extraordinary was happening inside that courtroom. Marcus walked quietly through the side entrance, wearing the same faded uniform he had worn for years. He pushed his cart, though today he knew he would spend little time cleaning. As he walked down the hallway, people stared, some with admiration, others with doubt. He kept his head steady, reminding himself that he was not here for attention. He was here because a man had been left defenseless and he had promised to stand by him. Inside the courtroom, Alexander was already seated at the defense table. He looked tired, but when he saw Marcus enter, a small sense of relief showed on his face. For the first time since the trial had begun, he no longer felt abandoned. He had someone beside him, someone who, though not a trained lawyer, carried courage that money could never buy. The judge arrived, stern as ever, and the gavel struck to bring order. The prosecutor was ready, his stack of papers higher than before, his eyes sharp with determination. He had been embarrassed yesterday when a janitor had poked holes in his witnesses' stories. And now he was determined to crush this man and prove that the law belonged only to the trained and the powerful. The prosecutor began with renewed fire, presenting new witnesses and carefully prepared evidence. His voice was strong and his words carried confidence. He pointed at documents, showed charts, and spoke with the skill of a man who had spent his life mastering the art of persuasion. The jury listened carefully, and at times it seemed the balance was tipping back in his favor. Marcus listened to every word, his mind working quickly. He wrote notes on a pad, circling points that didn't add up, underlining sentences that could be challenged. He was not intimidated by the prosecutor's polished style. Instead, he focused on the details, the small cracks that others overlooked. When it was time for cross-examination, the judge once again looked at Marcus. "Mr. Johnson, you may proceed," he said, his voice carrying both caution and curiosity. Marcus rose, walked toward the witness stand, and began his questions. He spoke simply, but each question was sharp and precise. He asked about dates, about names, about details in the documents the prosecutor had presented. Slowly, he began to show the jury that things were not as clear as they seemed. A witness who had sounded certain began to hesitate. A timeline that looked solid began to show gaps. Piece by piece, Marcus revealed that the story against Alexander was not built on stone but on sand. The jury leaned forward, whispering among themselves. Reporters scribbled faster than ever. Even the judge shifted slightly in his seat, impressed by the way Marcus asked his questions with such calm determination. The prosecutor grew tense, his jaw tight as he realized his case was slipping again. At one point, the prosecutor tried to humiliate Marcus. "Tell me, Mr. Johnson," he said with a mocking smile, "how long have you been sweeping these floors? 20 years? And now you expect us to believe you understand the law better than those of us who studied it for decades?" The courtroom laughed nervously, but Marcus did not flinch. He looked directly at the prosecutor and replied, "I have swept these floors for 20 years, yes. And for 20 years I have listened to every word spoken in this court. I have studied the books others threw away. I may not have your degree, but I know that truth does not belong only to the educated. Truth belongs to anyone willing to see it." The room went silent. The prosecutor's smirk faded, and the jury looked at Marcus with newfound respect. Even Alexander felt a swell of pride as he listened. The day went on, and Marcus continued to battle with words, not with anger, but with steady logic. The prosecutor attacked, and Marcus countered. The prosecutor mocked, and Marcus remained calm. Slowly, the balance shifted again. What had begun as a hopeless trial for Alexander now looked like a fight that could actually be won. During a short break, Alexander leaned toward Marcus and whispered, "I don't understand you. Why are you doing this? You don't owe me anything." "I have nothing to offer you," Marcus smiled faintly. "It's not about what you can offer me. It's about what's right. No man should be left defenseless when the truth is on his side. I've seen too many people crushed in this place because they had no one to stand for them. Today I choose not to let that happen to you." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. For years he had believed money was the only thing that earned loyalty, But here was a man who had nothing, risking everything for him. It shook him in a way no courtroom argument ever could. When the session ended that day, the crowd outside exploded with questions. Cameras flashed in Marcus's face. Reporters shouted his name, and strangers reached out to shake his hand. But Marcus simply said, "I am not a hero. I am just a man who believes in fairness." Then he walked away, leaving the press stunned by his humility. That night, Marcus sat at his small kitchen table with his law book spread before him. He studied late into the night, preparing for the next day's battle. He knew the prosecutor would come harder, and the judge's patience would be tested. But he also knew that the jury was beginning to see him not as a janitor, but as a man who spoke truth. Meanwhile, Alexander lay awake in his mansion, thinking about Marcus. For the first time in his life, he realized that wealth could not protect him the way a single act of courage could. He thought about the look in Marcus's eyes when he said he would defend him, and he knew that no lawyer he had ever hired had shown that kind of loyalty. The city buzzed with excitement, newspapers selling out with stories about the janitor lawyer. Some mocked the situation, calling it ridiculous, while others called it inspiring. People in coffee shops, offices, and homes debated whether Marcus would actually succeed. But no matter what they thought, all agreed they had never seen anything like it before. And in the quiet of his small apartment, Marcus whispered to himself, "Tomorrow, I must be stronger. Tomorrow I must show them that truth does not bow to power." The battle was not over. The biggest test was still to come. But the janitor who once went unseen was now the center of the nation's attention, standing tall in a place where few believed he belonged, ready to fight not with wealth or status, but with the strength of his mind and the courage of his heart. The final day of the trial arrived with even greater attention than before. By now, the story of the janitor defending the billionaire had spread across the country. Television crews lined the courthouse steps, newspapers carried Marcus Johnson's picture on their front pages, and people argued in shops, buses, and homes about whether he could actually succeed. Some called him a symbol of courage, others dismissed him as a fool, but all were eager to know how the story would end. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The judge entered, his expression stern as always, but there was something different in his eyes, a recognition that this trial was no longer ordinary. The prosecutor was ready with his final arguments, determined to crush Marcus once and for all. He had spent the night preparing every word, certain that the law would not allow a janitor to defeat him. Alexander Cross sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly. For a man used to controlling every detail of his empire, it was strange to sit quietly and watch as another man, someone who had once been invisible to him, fought to protect his future. He glanced at Marcus, who stood calmly by his side, holding nothing but a notepad and his unshakable resolve. Alexander had never trusted anyone the way he trusted Marcus now. The prosecutor rose first, delivering a fiery speech to the jury. He spoke of greed, power, and responsibility. He painted Alexander as a man who thought himself above the law, a man who deserved to be brought down. His words were sharp, his gestures strong, and his confidence clear. He ended by pointing at Alexander and declaring, "No man, no matter how wealthy, should escape justice." The jury listened closely, their faces serious. Reporters scribbled furiously and cameras clicked. To many, it sounded convincing. The prosecutor sat down, satisfied that he had regained control. Then the judge turned to Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice steady, "you may present your closing argument." The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the janitor. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others with doubt, but all waited. Marcus rose slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom, and looked at the jury. He took a deep breath and spoke. "I know what you are all thinking," he began, his voice calm but clear. "I am not a lawyer. I wear this uniform, not a suit. I came here to sweep floors, not to stand in front of you. But when I saw a man left alone, I could not remain silent. Because justice is not about who has the most money, or who wears the best clothes, or who has the loudest voice. Justice is about truth." The jury leaned forward. The judge watched intently. Even the prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Marcus continued. "You have heard many words during this trial. You have seen documents, you have listened to witnesses. Some of those words sounded strong, but when we asked questions, the strength faded. You saw witnesses hesitate. You saw stories change. You saw details that did not match. That is not truth, that is doubt. And in this courtroom, doubt means we cannot take away a man's freedom. He paused, letting the silence settle. I am just a janitor. I don't own skyscrapers. I don't sit on boards. But I have spent years watching, listening, and learning. And I know that what matters is not who speaks, but what is true. And the truth is, this case is not as strong as it was made to look. The truth is, there is not enough here to say this man is guilty. The jury exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly. Marcus's voice grew stronger. We are all equal in this room. The law does not belong only to the powerful. It belongs to every man, every woman, every child who seeks fairness. Today I stand here not because I wanted fame, not because I wanted to be seen, but because I could not let a man stand alone when fairness was at stake. You, the jury, are the guardians of that fairness, and I ask you to guard it well. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. No one laughed. No one scoffed. For a long moment it felt as though the world itself had paused. Then Marcus returned to his seat, his face calm, his heart steady. The jury left to deliberate. Hours passed slowly. The reporters outside sent updates every few minutes. People around the country waiting for the verdict. Inside the courtroom, Alexander sat in quiet thought, occasionally glancing at Marcus. He had never been so unsure of his future, yet never so grateful for another person. At last the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper that carried Alexander's fate. The judge asked for the verdict, not guilty, the foreman announced. Gasps filled the room. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, and Alexander slumped in relief. The prosecutor closed his eyes, defeated. Marcus sat quietly, his expression calm but his heart filled with a quiet joy. He had done what no one believed possible. He had defended a man not with wealth or power, but with truth and courage. Alexander turned to Marcus, his voice shaking. You saved me. You truly saved me. I can never repay you for this. Marcus gave a small smile. You don't owe me anything. I only did what was right. But Alexander shook his head. No, Marcus. You did more than what was right. You gave me back my life when everyone else turned away. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted as Alexander and Marcus stepped through the doors. Reporters surrounded them, microphones and cameras pushing forward, but Alexander raised a hand. Today, he said, justice was defended not by money, not by power, but by courage. Marcus Johnson stood for me when no one else would, and I will never forget it. The crowd cheered, but Marcus quietly slipped away, not seeking the spotlight. He walked down the steps away from the flashing cameras, back toward the quiet streets where he lived. In the days that followed, the story spread even further. People across the nation spoke of Marcus with respect. Some called for him to be given a scholarship to study law. Others wrote letters praising his courage. He received invitations to speak, offers of money, even job opportunities, but Marcus remained humble. He continued his work, though now everyone who passed him looked at him differently. Alexander, true to his word, did not forget. He met with Marcus privately and offered him more than money. He offered him the chance to go to law school, all expenses paid. The world needs men like you in the courtroom, Alexander said. Men who fight not for profit, but for fairness. Marcus hesitated at first, but deep inside he knew this was the path he had always dreamed of. With quiet gratitude, he accepted. And so the janitor who had once been invisible became a student once more, walking into classrooms with the same determination he had carried into the courtroom. He was older than most of his classmates, but he carried something greater than youth. He carried the fire of justice that had been tested and proven before the world. Years later, people would remember the trial not for the charges, not for the billionaire, but for the janitor who stood up and said, I will defend him. They would remember the man who showed that courage could come from anywhere, that truth did not belong to the powerful alone, and that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones no one sees until the moment they are needed most. And Marcus, walking quietly into his future, knew one thing with certainty. He had not only defended a man, he had defended the meaning of justice itself.